Hello, friends. This is Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy with Catholic Studies Academy. Welcome to Take Every Thought Captive. Today, I'm joined by my good friend and regular co-host, Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, and we're going to be talking about Advent and Christmas, but from a theological and liturgical perspective, an area where Dr. Bulzacchelli has a lot of expertise. We decided to talk about this because one of the reasons we decided to talk about this is right now, Advent is probably more popular than it's been in the past. We can see, some of our Protestant friends, are celebrating Advent. Sometimes this causes a little bit of debate within their own communities, which is kind of interesting as well. Sometimes these celebrations are not accompanied by you might call a historical Catholic perspective on Advent, and so probably they lose some of their meaning and full value. But in truth, Dr. Bulzacchelli, I think that could probably be said of a lot of our own Catholic celebrations and of Advent as well. I don't think it's just our Protestant friends who suffer from that. To be sure.
I mean, I don't know what it's like in Europe, but at least in the United States, right? I mean, we both grew up in the United States and different parts of it. And it just really seems that Advent is regarded by most people, Catholic or Protestant, as the Christmas season. And then when Christmas actually occurs on the liturgical calendar, it ends very abruptly, right?
It's very abruptly. That's right. That's right.
And we lose the awareness of Christmas being its own season, right? And Advent being its own season, preparing us for something.
That's true. As you know, I grew up Protestant and not Catholic. I converted when I was in college. So all liturgical seasons to me were foreign. Really, including, we didn't even celebrate Good Friday. That was not a thing. You're like, that's just a Catholic thing. That's not,
Yeah, that's
like we went on Sundays. That was the day. Like Sunday is the day, and there are no other things but Sunday. Now that's kind of an older Protestant way, I think, of thinking among sort of evangelical Baptist kind of folks.
A lot of Protestants. They started doing the midweek thing on Wednesday.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
But
that's true.
And I think that just basically, I don't know, because I was never in that community, but and I never asked anyone about it specifically. But I got the impression that it was an effort. It was an effort to kind of make being Christian a bit more intentional, right? To have it be a part of our lives, not just on Sunday, right?
Correct. Yeah, I think so. I think that's fair.
Yeah,
very often, it involves small groups too. But in any event, the Advent has a rich history, and understood it's its own liturgical season. It's actually one of my favorites, I think, just because it's so steeped in wonderful biblical allusions and prophecies. You get all these rich texts from Isaiah. I personally think Isaiah is one of the most beautiful books of sacred scripture. Could you speak a little bit to the origins of Advent?
Yeah. So this may surprise us to think about this, right? Because to throw the Protestants a bone on this, it's the liturgical season of Advent is not. It's not really ancient. I mean, it's old. It's been around for a long time, but it's not. Ignatius of Antioch knew nothing about it. In all likelihood, St. Augustine didn't know about it.
Interesting.
The reason, right, is that it wasn't until the 4th century that Christmas even appeared on the calendar as a liturgical feast. And this is hard for us to kind of wrap our heads around, right? Because from our point of view, Christmas is the big one. And Easter seems almost secondary, right? But actually, what we know about the primitive church was that
it's the opposite. Right?
Easter Sunday, it's the opposite, right? Easter Sunday was celebrated from apostolic times.
Yes, right,
It was from apostolic times, right?
Yeah.
And and we even have very, very ancient evidence of a liturgical season in preparation for Easter.
Okay.
Because there was a dispute over when to celebrate Easter.
Mm.
And people thought that it caused scandal. And the reason that it caused scandal, right, was that people would look at Christians and they would see some of the Christians fasting and some of the Christians feasting at the same time.
Okay,
and they would think, well, they don't know what they're about, right?
Right.
Well, that observation from second century, right, early second century, I think, tells us that there was a season of fasting, a season of preparation prior to the Easter Vigil, right? So there was Easter, and there was Lent in apostolic times. Christmas doesn't show up until the 4th century.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and the reason for that, right? The reason it does show up is, I think, in some ways kind of natural, and in other ways strangely political. Okay, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way. It's just sort of a matter of fact thing.
Sure.
It was in the 4th century that Christianity, having become the religion of the empire,
right,
began to become important from the perspective of public festivals. And this was the period in which the Ordo was established, right? The period in which liturgical norms began to be regularized from throughout different regions of the empire. And while it's true, you still have distinction in rites, and there are very different looks to the liturgy in different places, there were certain elements of it that just got written down. And one of the weird things that happened during this time, right, was that you had to deal with saints. I mean, this may seem, from our point of view, we got it all worked out, right?
Yeah, we can look back on it. Yeah, sure.
In the primitive church, saints were just like grandma, right? It was like people in your parish. And they lived holy lives, and the community recognized it. And
am I mistaken, Rich, in thinking that Augustine wrote a couple of things sort of complaining about the way people, maybe I'm thinking of something else, but kind of complaining a little bit about the way people celebrated the saints, like in graveyards and things like that, or
the
something,
superstitions about it.
Yeah.
So
they could grow up, maybe, if it wasn't regulated or something.
Right. But what it was really about, though, was early on was recognizing them as proof of holiness, right? Models of holiness and demonstrations that it's possible to live the Christian life. It's possible to run the race, right?
Right.
And but it was local. Like it was your parish, it was your diocese, but it wasn't like the whole church.
So was it basically like by popular acclaim or something like that?
Yeah, by popular acclaim. And that popular acclaim business actually carried on for a very, very long time, and well into the Middle Ages.
Interesting.
Yeah, there are plenty of saints that we can say we
never went through the process, like the contemporary process. A
specific time they were canonized.
Right.
But what did you do with all these saints once you start producing these norms that extend across the empire? I never heard of Grandma Agnes. I don't know who she is. Well, obviously not all saints could be celebrated by everyone all the time. And so the big ones, right, that everyone recognized were the sort of the early ones to go in the calendar. John the Baptist, the Virgin Mary had plenty of feasts. She was starting to get more and more feasts during this time. But there were feasts for the Blessed Virgin. And then they worked out sort of calendars, right, for these saints who could be recognized throughout the whole church. And many, many more just kind of faded away. And that's one of the reasons we ended up with the Feast of All Saints, which was pretty early in development, right? But
Make sure we
Uh,
got any in that we've forgotten.
yeah, I mean, it was early in development. People don't maybe appreciate just how much traces back to this period from about the fourth century to about the
Sure.
sixth century.
Okay.
Um, and that's when Christmas appeared on the calendar, right? During that time.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't always celebrated on the same day.
Mhm.
It wasn't always celebrated on December 25th. We don't really know for sure why,
Okay.
it was celebrated, but they had pagan feasts, and I know this caused a scandal for many people, but feasts surrounding the winter solstice were a common feature in paganism.
Mhm.
And if you think about it from a missionary perspective, it's not an unreasonable thing to try to supplant the feast of the very people you're trying to missionize, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Because customs are very powerful things, right?
Sure.
And you want to give them something that feels familiar,
Right.
while at the same time taking away the excuse to just do what they did before.
Mhm. Mhm.
So settling on December 25th, you could make arguments for it, maybe not based in history exactly, but
Okay.
symbolically, right?
Yeah.
That
It's
December
interesting.
25th is a fine time to put.
Mhm. So was this originally like a celebration of the nativity of Jesus Christ or
Yeah,
something
the
like
Nativity of
that?
Jesus Christ.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then the question is, well, this seems like a really important thing to celebrate, right? And
Yeah, I mean, really, like it's sort of like you would sort of think, obviously, in a way, maybe that's just
yeah.
maybe that's anachronistic, but
Well, I think it is anachronistic if you're going back to the very early days of the church.
sure, because of the overwhelming weight of Easter. I mean,
Right.
it does make sense theologically, right? That Easter is, it's was it 800-pound gorilla? I mean, it is the liturgical celebration of the whole, year.
Yeah. Right. I mean,
Mhm.
it's when the victory is won,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But here's another thing to consider. It
Mhm.
was during this time also, right, fourth century, fifth century, sixth century, that we began to kind of reconceptualize what liturgical feasts meant.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we began to think of the liturgy in more cosmic, sort of cosmological terms.
Mhm.
Um, and and so we began to see, I think, the importance of the the moment of the birth of Christ, right? When Christ when Christ breaks in upon the cosmos, and
Mhm.
in this definitive way, right?
Mhm.
The battle's already won. Easter is already anticipated in that very moment.
Sure.
And you could see that in the iconography that we associate with the Nativity of Christ, right? Look very
Mhm.
carefully at it, and you'll see some very interesting symbols. There's typically, right, in an Eastern uh, icon of the Nativity of Christ, you'll see things like, this isn't universal, but you'll often see the Virgin Mary with her back turned to the baby Jesus.
Mhm.
And it's as if she's kind of giving him over to his destiny to become a
Mhm.
creature of sacrifice. And the way he's wrapped in swaddling clothes, he looks an awful lot like someone prepared for burial.
Mhm.
And often the manger is depicted as a tiny sarcophagus.
That's interesting and kind of
Yeah,
creepy, to be honest.
and it's kind of creepy. Yeah, yeah, it is a little creepy. And another feature of it, right, is
Mhm.
Saint Joseph is off in a corner very
Mhm.
frequently, um, being tempted by the devil.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Um, well, it's supposed to be you don't really believe that he's the son of God, right?
Uh-huh.
Mary's
Uh-huh.
been doing stuff behind your back. I mean, that
Okay, I
that's
see.
basically
Uh,
that's what Satan is trying to put into Joseph's ear, according to
okay.
the traditional reading of that.
Mhm.
And so you see this, this drama of temptation and death and triumph over it, which
Mhm.
is already anticipating Easter in the iconography of
Mhm.
the incarnation.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
How
right. It's interesting. So you see like what we had to put this feast on the calendar because Easter's so important. Of course, Christmas is just as important, right? The Nativity of Christ is just as important because it's only a matter of time before we get to Easter. Once the incarnation happens, the victory of Christ at Easter is a foregone conclusion.
Right. It's already wrapped into sort of the equation, as it were. Yeah. That's interesting. Do you know, like, about what time that iconography became prevalent, or?
No, I don't know for sure. Like those particular features of it. I couldn't say with those particular features, but they're pretty well rooted in the tradition.
It's interesting. There's a because certainly I think when I think of a contemporary Western, well, maybe not even say contemporary, but Western, maybe medieval or Renaissance depiction, right? There's a lot of like celebration, I think, is the keynote, right? Joy. I mean, even a lot of there's joy. We'll talk a little bit about Advent, the real meaning of Advent here in a minute, but with Christmas, properly speaking, right? There's a strong note of joy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the angels singing. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's just this sort of, now there is this sort of this hint, right? Some hints, right, of, the sacrifice to come, right?
Yeah.
But I think, the overwhelming emphasis, right, is this sort of just kind of refulgence, sort of how many cherubim can we stick on the on the crest? We want it to be gold, we want it to be as much as possible, like this. I mean, and myself, that sort of stuff has a limited appeal to me, but personally, but at the same time, it is kind of interesting. I mean, it is arresting, right? The degree of, at least in the Western sort of tradition, just exuberance, I guess.
Yeah, but I think there's more confluence there than meets the eye.
Okay.
And I think it has a bit to do with just the way the frames of mind, right, in East and West. So when in the East, when you think about Easter, you're thinking about the triumph. And the Passion is just sort of the stop in between, right? It's not Western thinking about Easter actually focuses primarily on the moment of sacrifice on the cross. It seems our focus is more on Good Friday, right? The sacrifice that Christ makes. And then, having made the sacrifice, he triumphs over death. The Eastern perspective is really focused on the resurrection, right? So when Christ dies on the cross, in that Eastern perspective, that's an act of aggression against the devil, right? I mean, he's breaching Satan's kingdom in the pit. He's penetrating hell, right? Like a Trojan horse. And so the Easter, right, is about, he's won the victory. He entered into that battle and then emerged victorious. It's a bit of a different emphasis. So I would say then, right, that when you look at the iconography and it's all pointing in the direction of death, yeah, that's true. But that death is itself an attack against the devil.
The victory in its own way, yeah.
Yeah, right.
That's interesting, yeah.
So when you look at the Western tradition on Christmas now, right? Think about the image of this baby in the manger commanding the angels in heaven.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
So the whole heavenly host, right? The armies of heaven are at the command of this little baby.
Yeah, I can see that. There's a connection there. So how does Advent come into this? So Christmas develops sort of late-ish. I mean,
Yeah, I mean early but late. I mean, later.
Early, yeah. And maybe, I guess, still, even in the 4th century, we're still working out. We don't have anything probably quite like the, degrees of solemnity and that sort of thing. We're kind of moving in that direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're still fairly open to some degree, or there's some maybe some wiggle room and ambiguity there. But where does Advent start to come in?
Yeah, so Advent starts to show up really in the 6th century, maybe the late 6th century. You start to see movements in the direction of Advent. I wouldn't call it really a liturgical season. But you start to see people making decisions about how we ought to prepare for Christmas. If Christmas is an important feast, you want to be prepared for it, just like you're prepared for Easter, right? And so what you start to do is you see the penitential liturgies from Lent being used on certain days in the weeks in advance of Christmas.
So really like a repetition of those liturgies?
Yeah, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Yeah, you'll take the masses from parts of Lent and you'll celebrate those during the weeks leading up to Christmas.
Okay, interesting.
And for in different places and at different times, the number of weeks you prepared was different.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't always just 4 weeks, 4 Sundays the way it is now.
Right. Can you say anything because I know some of my traditions friends have a particular affection for Ember Days.
Yeah.
Is that sort of related or?
Not really.
Okay.
I don't believe they're really related. I know that people pounce on me for that, but a colleague of mine from the Society for Catholic Liturgy wrote a pretty nice piece on the Ember Days several years back. His name, as I say, his name is Michael Foley.
Okay.
He wrote a pretty nice piece. It was published in Bulzacchelli on the Ember Days, and he explains it. He explains the history of it and what it's supposed to mean.
Okay.
And one of the things he points out there, if I remember the article correctly, is that the Ember Days occur in transitions between seasons on the
gotcha. Okay, gotcha.
on the year, right? So it's not really liturgic. It's not really attached to liturgical seasons as such, but to the changing of the seasons of the year, if I remember him correctly. And and so a person might say, I'm not arguing this, but a person might say, gee, that sounds kind of pagan, to be celebrating the changing of seasons. I don't think that's a legitimate criticism against Ember Days. What I would say is there's a long tradition in Christianity of sanctifying time itself. Right? We see this in the development of the Liturgy of the Hours, which is very early. Right? The Liturgy of the Hours is pretty darn early.
Right.
At least it's as early as what we're talking about with Christmas. Right? It's the time of Saint
and not just and not just monks, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. At least in the great municipal churches, right, of the ancient church, right? You could have the Liturgy of the Hours celebrated by the people.
Right. So, I mean, it's a pretty old concept, right? Sanctify time. Well, why not? Right. I mean, God wants to sanctify the entire cosmos. Time is a part of that.
That's an interesting statement you said there. I was talking to my kids about something theological, and one of my oldest son asked a question, well, why is that necessary? Right. And I thought for a second, I said, I think that's the wrong question.
Yeah, that is the wrong question.
I said, it's not maybe strictly necessary, but there's some good reason for X, Y, and Z, right? And we know that it is, right, from say Revelation or something like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's not strictly necessary, Isn't that interesting though that the human mind does kind of, and maybe it's part of our rational nature. We want the necessary explanation. Maybe there's not a necessary explanation, but like a lot of things aren't necessary. You think about things, little things that maybe your parents did for you to make your life nicer, right?
Uh-huh.
And more comfortable and happier. They weren't strictly necessary.
Yeah.
In fact, lovers do. In fact, a big part of being a lover, whether romantic or otherwise, right, is doing the non-necessary.
Yeah.
Right? I think in a way, but
Yeah, it is a very. I actually think that question arises mostly from our Western tendency toward rationalism. That we really want something to be proven as necessary, or we suspend belief. And so it's kind of a dangerous question, right?
You want to
So
start?
I was going to say that God acts gratuitously from the beginning, right? He doesn't have to create.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. So if that's your logic, if that's the starting point, then does God need the sacraments? Are they strictly necessary from God?
Right.
For God to do what he wants to do? Well, no, but I mean,
this is the way he's decided to do it. He has some good reason for doing it.
Right. Yeah, and maybe we should ask ourselves, right, what do I have to learn about what God is up to, about the way he thinks about us, right?
So kind of thinking about like that point in connection with liturgical seasons and liturgical matters, right?
Yeah.
You can say, it's not strictly necessary to have Ember Days. It's not strictly necessary to, what lots of things in liturgy aren't strictly necessary, right?
Yeah, but maybe they're good.
But maybe they're good, and we should just explore and be interested in what's good about them, that's interesting.
I would say though that the Ember Days, as with and Christmas, right, and Advent, they emerged over time.
Sure.
Like, so the liturgical calendar can change, right? I don't think it should change willy-nilly, but I mean it can change, it can evolve, and things can. There have been feasts in the past that have been suppressed, and
sure.
And so I think that's fine to some degree, right? To introduce new feasts and maybe let others drop away if they no longer seem useful. Although I'm really disinclined to kind of just start hacking away at things, but
that seems like the kind of thing you definitely want to develop organically over time.
Yes,
there may need to be pruning and readjusting, but sort of like kind of like with your yard or your property, right? You don't just sort of like, oh, to heck with it, I'm just going to put down pavement everywhere.
Right.
Like you might say, this bush has grown too large, it's time to trim it back, there's some things that have been neglected here, and we're going to make some more room for that, and that seems to make sense, right? But you don't just sort of like just plow up the front yard on a whim, right?
I mean, when your neighbor does that, you kind of look and you think,
that's right. Like, is he okay?
I think he's lost his mind.
That's right. That's funny. But with respect to Advent here, and you tell me if I'm wrong about this, Rich. You're pointing out sort of its historical development in relationship to kind of a penitential preparation season, right?
Yeah, that's right. So
one of the things that strikes me about a lot of the readings in Advent since the Second Vatican Council, right, is that those readings tend to be fairly eschatological.
Yeah.
Right. And I'll just say that's kind of I don't know if that's, I'm not familiar with the pre-Vatican II Advent on this point. But if that is kind of a development, I think that's a fairly positive development. I mean, I kind of like the fact that I think once a year, at least, a sermon during Advent where the priest points out that we're not just anticipating Christ's first coming, but also anticipating the return of Christ.
Yeah.
And that seems to me a powerful theological theme, that's worthy of
and it's
consideration and affection.
It's not new.
Okay.
I mean, that's a pretty old concept. Okay. Really, there are three things, right? There's the past, the present, and the future.
Oh, okay, great.
Right. So there's there's we're anticipating the birth of Christ, right? Which of course is a thing of the past for us. We're preparing ourselves, right, to kind of make room in the heart for our own conversion, for our own reception of Christ,
right,
into our lives. And that's why it's a penitential season.
Okay.
And then, of course, this life that we're living is oriented toward the final judgment.
Right.
And so there's an eschatological aspect to this, right? So we want to prepare ourselves for the parousia. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, right? This used to really be, once it got revved up, right? It really was regarded as a penitential season. And it was really under Gregory the Seventh, right, in the 11th century.
Okay.
That it got standardized as the 4 weeks, or the 4 Sundays of Advent. But it was in about the 12th century that fasting was kind of dropped, right? So a couple hundred years, it was a season of fasting. And so penance was still a part of it. Abstinence was still a part of it, but actual fasting was no longer. So we started to speak of the Great Lent, and then by implication, Advent is sort of a lesser Lent.
Sure. But still distinctly a Lent, right?
Yeah, still a Lent.
And distinct from Christmas, right? Yeah. So every once in a while, I like to be a little bit of a curmudgeon with some of my Catholic friends, and you know, when they're wishing me, you know, Merry Christmas on, you know, December 18th or something, you know, kind of with a grin, you know, of course, I'm gonna be a jerk about it, but it's not Christmas. Right? It's Advent, right?
Yeah. I wish you, by way of anticipation, that when Christmas arrives, it will be merry.
When it is actually Christmas, it will be merry for you. That's right.
It's a little longer. It takes a little longer to say that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So, yeah. The so where do we go from here, though? I mean, like, we recognize that this, you know, there's something to this liturgical season. We shouldn't let it fade away. And it seems like it has faded away to a great extent. As you pointed out, even Protestants, though, are starting to think that maybe there's a void in the way that we treat Christmas, right?
Right.
We do need this preparation after all. And so maybe there's a comeback. But I think that where we are right now is a place of confusion, right? I mean, we don't really quite remember what Advent is for. I mean, maybe we're talking about it, but the average Christian, even the average Catholic, I think probably doesn't really understand what the season is for.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, when I think about it, like I'm reticent at this point in history, right, to be a bah humbug, you know, and to be overly censorious on the matter. Although I will, like I say, you know, to tease people about it sometimes, and I will say, for my own practice, my family's practice, you know, for practical reasons, because of my own family situation, you know, we used to not put up any Christmas decorations until Christmas Eve. Now we've changed out a little bit to the Sunday before Christmas, just to say, because of my own practical circumstances. But you know, if I had my druthers and could just do whatever, you know, I wanted with that situation, then I would say, I would. And one easy-ish way, right, maybe to move in that direction is of reclaiming and revivifying Advent, and at the same time revivifying, I think, Christmas, right, as well, right, is to delay decoration, maybe
Hmm.
until Christmas Eve or something like that. And then to fully celebrate Christmas, for, the weeks after the 25th,
Yeah.
you know,
So, yeah, I have some views about this too, and I agree strongly with some of what you're saying. I don't think that Advent should be free of decoration. I used to. There was a time when I was like, no, right? But like, I don't think so. I think Advent should have its own decoration, right?
distinct, yeah.
Because
Some people do that with the crest,
there's an
right?
aspect, there is an aspect of anticipatory joy during the
Sure,
season.
sure, yeah.
So I think and remember the church in the 12th century, right? They dropped the fasting part.
Mm.
So you're abstaining from certain things, sure, but it's not quite the same thing as what's going on.
Sure, right.
So maybe it could be festive, but we have a tradition of Advent carols that are distinct from Christmas carols, and maybe we should. I mean, I really think Catholics should start developing playlists that are just Advent.
That's
right?
interesting. Yeah,
Advent stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They sound a lot like Christmas carols, right? Because they're all madrigals.
Sure.
But they're their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the readings across Advent, the Advent wreath is a good thing, right?
Sure.
I think you could put your Christmas tree up during Advent. I think these days technology actually can help us out a lot because it's not hard to make LED lights that could be different colors, right? and I mean, maybe you want lights to be purple during Advent and then turn them white or multicolored Christmas or whatever, right? But I think there are ways for us to mark the distinction. Where I agree with you very, very strongly is that we can't allow Christmas to end at 8 p.m. on December 25th.
Right.
That's not what it looks like on the calendar at all.
I think that the pressure of that is, and this is, an obvious thing to say, the pressure and codification of that is it's the culmination of the commercial season of Christmas.
Yeah, and that's not acceptable.
Right. I mean,
that's not an acceptable explanation for
I mean, but teleologically, right? I mean, I think the way it kind of works, right, is the 25th is when you rip open all the gifts, right?
Yeah.
That you've been working so hard to buy and so forth. And so then what's left to do? I mean, Christmas is over, right? Like, you've opened the gifts, you have them, you possess the things, and it's done.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you say that, right? The you could see how inadequate that explanation is.
Yeah.
And like we can't let that be the reason.
No,
right?
Right.
So often people think that, no, Christmas is 12 days. But no, it's longer than that. Okay. The traditionally baptism of our Lord, right? The nativity is the beginning. It's not just the birth, right? But the whole origin story of Jesus.
Right.
And that leads up to the beginning of his public ministry. So it's funny, the way we talk about it. If you look at the contemporary calendar, this concept of ordinary time is an invention of the 1970 Missal. But we didn't used to have it, right? But when we mark the calendar, we say that the Feast of the Baptism of our Lord is the first Sunday of ordinary time. But in fact, traditionally, it's not. It's a Christmas feast. It's white, right? The liturgical colors are white. The way I think you should regard it is as a transitional feast. And And I could give you another example of a transitional feast, right? A feast in which the beginning is one season and the end is another, right? A great example of this would be Holy Thursday, right?
Okay.
Where Holy Thursday, you notice, is a white day.
Right.
It's a solemnity. But when it ends, you're in the Triduum.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The beginning, right? The chrism and all this kind of stuff in the beginning. That's a whole different kind of celebration.
Right.
But in this, you flip over into the Passion.
Yeah. That's neat. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think those are all good ways to think about it. I know we leave our decorations up, I think, usually until that point. Because we tend to put them up so late. Yeah. Those are all good things. And I think, when you're focusing on it, is really, I just say don't want to be a bah humbug to anybody's particular traditions and things about this, but I mean, obviously the thing you do want to focus on is that these are distinct seasons and they're distinct pieties. They're distinct modes of devotion, right? One is very preparatory, right? Anticipatory, right? The other has a little more of a sign of realization, and one of the things I think is really interesting to think about is, especially with all of the fulfillment in Christmas of these messianic prophecies, is to think about the kingship of Christ. I know the kingship of Christ comes at the kind of a different time, but it's just interesting, right? Like, this is a time where we think about, especially from a New Testament context, right, or a biblical context, right, redemptive history. The king has come, right? I mean, so many of the prophecies, right, are about this messianic king, right?
Yeah,
and what we're celebrating, right, is hey, the Messiah has come, right?
Yeah.
He's been born, and then I think there's this huge doctrinal biblical sort of theme to sort of really devote ourselves to and to contemplate and celebrate of Christ as the messianic king and as his coming, as the coming of the kingdom.
Right? Yeah, that's right. So I got a couple of things to say about that, actually, right? We have on the calendar the Feast of Christ the King, which currently is in November, right? And it's the last feast of the liturgical year.
Right.
Now, when that feast was first introduced, it was introduced very late, actually.
Of course, yeah, sure.
Right,
yeah.
Very late, like 20th century. And it was originally in October. So the question is, why was the Feast of Christ the King placed where it was to begin with, and then where it is now? Well, I kind of think that the reason it was placed in October was that on November 1st, you had the Feast of All Saints. And so the Feast of All Saints is, and the Feast of All Souls, right? These are kind of eschatological feasts.
Sure.
And we're talking about the All Saints is the Church triumphant, right?
Right.
So you kind of want to, maybe you want to celebrate the parousia. You want to have this sort of event, and then look into heaven and see what's going on there.
Right.
But it was then moved later, right, till after the Feast of All Saints and All Souls. And probably because, I don't know for sure what their reasoning was, but I'm kind of thinking maybe it was thought, number one, that since we have the Feast of All Souls, and that includes people in, the church penitent,
Mm-hmm.
that the time of the parousia hasn't quite arrived.
Right.
Maybe
I
put in
got
the
you. I got
wrong
you.
spot.
Uh-huh.
And the other thing is that you're kind of, if you think about the liturgical year
Mm-hmm.
as taking us from creation all the way through
Yeah.
the
Sure.
culmination of reality, right? All
Right.
the way
Right.
through the
Yeah.
eschaton.
Mm-hmm.
Then it does make sense to kind of put that feast at the very end of the
At the
year.
very end. Sure. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, especially
But
if you're thinking about the perfection of the kingship, the perfection
yeah,
of the kingdom, that
right.
sort of thing. That makes some sense. Yeah.
But where I think it introduces some confusion, right, leading to maybe a diminished understanding of Advent
Mm-hmm.
and of Christmas, is if the celebration of the parousia is at the very end of the liturgical year,
Right.
then that aspect of Christmas tends to sort of fade into
Yeah.
the background, right?
Yeah.
But
Right.
on the other hand, what you're talking about, right, is really part of that idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, the incarnation is the first stage,
Sure.
right? But it does culminate in this thing. So
Right.
it's, in our creed, when we say that we look forward to we say that Christ will come again, right?
Mm-hmm.
He'll come again to judge the living and the
Mm-hmm.
dead.
Right.
In Greek, the word for again here is palin, which has the connotation of a sort of reverberation, right? An echo or a redounding. And so the implication, right, I think liturgically is to
Mm-hmm.
say that if he came in the first place, there's going to be this echo,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's going to reach its culmination. What
Mm-hmm.
began with the incarnation is
Right.
is going to come. It's going to come again, right? It's going to come back
Mm-hmm.
upon us, and not as if not in the sense, right, really of a secondary event, not in the sense of this happened and then some point in the future this other thing will happen, but instead the full implications of what happened in the
Mm-hmm.
incarnation will come to term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right, that's kind of the idea, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so already at Christmas you're beginning
Mm-hmm.
to celebrate the parousia. Now
Right.
let's think about this, because understanding what a parousia is kind of part of this issue, right? The idea of a parousia is all over Christian activity. It's an idea borrowed from the ancient world, right? As you probably know, kings, emperors,
Mm-hmm.
right, would go and manifest themselves in front of the people. They would go and be present to them, right?
Sure.
Parousia. They would be being over against, right? Here I am in my substantial existence right in front of you.
Right.
Okay. So you can see how ritualized that kind of thing is. The king
Mm-hmm.
makes his entrance. Okay. You
Sure.
see this even now, right? You see this with the monarch.
Sure.
So that's the idea of a parousia.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly at the incarnation, that's happening,
Mm-hmm.
right? God is being
Mm-hmm.
seen. He's coming
Right.
among his people, Emmanuel.
Sure.
But what we're anticipating in what we normally refer to as the parousia is where that's just totally, it's undeniable, right?
Right.
That's
sure.
happened.
Yeah.
No one can any longer say
Yeah.
they didn't
Yeah.
know.
I like to think about it as a full actualization, right, of it. And where you have the substantial actualization here, right? But Christ in many ways hides his kingship, right?
Yeah.
I love the passage in John where it actually says, and he knew the heart of the people, and that like they were going to try to make him king, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's not what I'm doing right now, right? Like,
Yeah.
I am the king. Like Christ is the king, right? He doesn't even be made king, right?
Yeah.
And of course, this opens, I think, and this is kind of what's wrapped up, I think, in Christmas and Advent. Interesting debates, right, about the nature of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Right. Of course. Right. And the nature of Christ's kingship. Right. And I would also add a part of this that sometimes drops out a little bit is the nature of Christ's warfare, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's proper to a king to conduct war against his enemies,
Mm-hmm.
right? And although he is the Prince of Peace, we're not fully at peace yet.
Uh-huh.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, there is still a time of struggle, right?
Yeah.
And we're in that time of struggle. We're kind of in this. Christ came, and he was born as king. He still is king, and he is the king to come, right? All three of those things are true. And at some point, the war will cease, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're still kind of in a time of war. Like, it's like, I know other people have used this analogy, but I like it, right? It's like between D-Day and, Victory in Europe Day, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're like, yeah, the good side has invaded, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're on the way towards victory. We're gonna win,
Mm-hmm.
but there's still a lot of fighting to be done in between, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and not to take us too far afield, but that seems to me part of the celebration of Christmas is, I mean, imagine like the celebration of people when D-Day happened,
Yeah, that's right.
That they're here, right?
Well, so that's what I was talking about when I,
Yeah.
the baby commanding the angelic hosts, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So the victory is won. Not totally yet, right?
There's still battles to be fought, right?
The idea of the church militant, right, is
sure.
which it's fallen out of fashion to talk about it, but the idea of the church militant is all about this understanding, right? We are actually in the battle, but the battle is won. We're assured of victory. Right.
Yeah. I think it's all that stuff is wrapped up, I think, in kind of the mystery of Christmas, the joy of Christmas, the celebration of it, right? And I think especially from a New Testament perspective, that anticipation and realization of those messianic prophecies, is right there.
Yeah. So the dating of Christmas, think of it being at midnight mass, and you've got the Christmas acclamation, and they're all, you just hear the incantation where the emperor and the all these various figures, these things going on, right? The whole world being at peace, right? That part of the thing, the whole world being at peace. Because you had said, right, well, it makes sense for a king to wage war against his enemies. But right now, the whole world, the oikomenos, that's the Roman Empire.
Right.
And it represents in the New Testament worldliness, right? It represents it's the order of this world, right? That's a really interesting idea in the New Testament that I think we don't appreciate nearly enough. The adoption of the concept of Gentile, right? The gentiles, as applying to the Roman Empire,
right?
That's a complete inversion. That's their word. Gentiles was the word that the Roman Empire used to describe people who were not in the Roman Empire,
right?
Who weren't under Roman law,
right?
This is civilization. This is the whole world, the oikonomos, right? But if you're outside of that, like you're a barbarian, right? And so when Judaism and Christianity began to adopt the idea, right, of the Gentiles as the Romans, right, as the pagans, that was sort of a thumb in the eye, right?
Right.
This is the real civilization. The kingdom has come. And think of Jesus' language in John, where he says, I have conquered the world, right? I've conquered the world. Or I have imposed a new order on the cosmos.
Sure.
Again, that's language from the ancient political world. That's what a king would say if he waged war, won victory, and now imposed his law on the place, right? That's what he would say.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, that's great stuff, Rich. Well, as we wrap up here, do you have any kind of final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with in terms of thoughts about Advent and Christmas, as Christmas is very close upon us now?
Yeah. So I guess I want to remind the audience and myself to really invest your, and did I drop out again?
Just
No.
for a second.
Okay. I want to remind the reader to invest yourself in Christmas as a season, and a pretty long one. I mean, it varies from one year to the next, but it could go on for a while. Go all the way through the baptism of our Lord. And you know what? One of the things that I always mean to do, I want to do, and it'd be good to do, would be for us as Catholics to really own our Catholicism, right? To really differentiate ourselves maybe from the larger culture by celebrating some of the lesser feasts, right? Some of the feasts that the world doesn't care much about. I mean, yeah, you get lots of presents on Christmas, so everybody cares about that.
Sure.
But maybe it'd be good to celebrate the feast of the baptism of our Lord. Maybe it'd be good to celebrate Epiphany. Right. And so you don't have to give people gifts, right? You don't have to, the world doesn't have to have anything to say about it, right?
Sure.
You don't need to have any concern.
Yeah.
But it would be a time for Christians to kind of come together and just recognize with one another that this is, we're celebrating a great moment in the history of salvation.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's great, Rich. I really appreciate that. Yeah. Just, I mean, there's a lot of great things about Christmas, about Advent, and especially as we're approaching Christmas here, things that we all think about, good memories and family, and all those things are rich and wonderful and add to our lives. But you do want to kind of keep that central sort of, you want to see all that within the perspective, right, of redemptive history, right? At the end of the day, right? That Christmas is so much more than the presents, right? As nice as those things are, that really does root us. It's an opportunity to remember to root ourselves, right, in that bigger story. That's the most important thing, right? And there's a variety of ways of doing that, but I totally agree. Yeah, that we should we go out of our way here or there and this or that way to try and do that. Like I said, celebrating the baptism of the Lord, celebrating Epiphany, those sorts of things. Those are great opportunities to kind of keep Christmas, right, in a serious sort of ongoing way. A great way of doing that, I think, is to maybe dedicate, start reading some of the gospel narratives, right, at Christmas, and keep going, into, like don't just stop at Christmas Day, like just keep going, I mean, that's a good way to say
it goes on for a while.
It goes on, right? Those are the powerful things. And I do want to say, I think that the lectionary, again, I don't have any expertise about the lectionary before the Second Vatican Council, but the lectionary as we have it now, I love that little devotional, The Word Among Us, because it just puts that lectionary right in front of you in a very easily accessible way. That's another great way. Just the church has really wisely chosen, I think, passages that will keep these things in front of you, so you don't have to do all the study yourself. It's there, right? So I'd encourage people maybe to adopt that. But it was Rich, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts about all this, your expertise in these matters. And until next time, God bless.